Bliss and Grit is an entirely listener-supported show. Supporting us is also designed to support you through keeping the episodes rolling, but also through rewards for your donation, like a Getting Started guide, a private forum, and downloadable meditations. To become a supporting member, you can visit patreon.com/bliss and grit. Hello, beautifuls. You are listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Brooke Thomas, and I'll be joined soon by my dear friend and co-host Vanessa Scotto, as well as our special guest today, Lisa Wimberger. On the show, we're having conversations about the awakening spiritual path, and what does that even mean? What is a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything, the beauty and the crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life? As I mentioned, we have a special guest today, Lisa Wimberger, and Lisa is the creator of Neurosculpting. Neurosculpting is a self-directed neuroplasticity protocol. Specifically, it's a mental training process that quiets our fight or flight center and activates our prefrontal cortex, which is the mind seat of our compassion and empathy. So needless to say, if you've listened to our past episodes and how interested we are in the intersection of the awakening path and what is up with our nervous systems, we had an awful lot to talk about with Lisa. In fact, we shared so many passions and inquiries in common that we are airing this conversation as a two-parter. So you'll get part one this week, and there's more coming at you next week. If you want more information on neurosculpting, you can visit neurosculptinginstitute.com. If you're enjoying the show, there are also a few ways you can support us. We always love to read reviews. They mean a lot to us personally, and it also helps more people find the show. You can head over to blissandgrit.com and subscribe there. We send out a Friday digest of resources that we're loving. Or you can become one of our supporting members on Patreon. We've chosen not to have advertisers on the show, so becoming a patron is the way to help us keep the episodes coming. If you've been benefiting from the show, we'd really appreciate your donation, and we hugely appreciate all of you who have already donated and help us keep this thing going. And we also both see clients privately, so feel free to go to the website blissandgrit.com for more information on that as well. Okay, here we go.
Everyone, and hi Brooke, and hi Lisa Wimberger.
Hi.
It's so nice to have Lisa on the show. We have a guest today, a special guest, as you're hearing, and I contacted Lisa, I guess it was about 5 to 7 years ago for the first time. We have a mutual friend, and I did a session with Lisa, and I've honestly been interested in neurosculpting ever since then.
That's a long time.
It's a long time. And I meant to do a training with you, and then this contemplative Buddhist psychology training. And I was like, I got to do this. And, as the woman who's always liking to get trained, I kept moving on. And then recently, Brooke and I were looking at the Sounds True Brain Change Summit, and you came up again. And I was like, we have to have Lisa on the show, because your story, your approach to healing and to reality, and the modality you created, neurosculpting, is so resonant with where Brooke and I are at right now.
Perfect. Well, then we should be having a conversation.
Oh, gosh. Good. Good.
We're so glad we are.
One of the best things about our job is that we get to speak to people like yourself and actually get some of the things we're really curious about answered. So. All right, here we go. Well, unusually, Lisa, normally we don't ask our guests a lot of questions about their personal story and their past, but you have a really interesting story, and your story is part and parcel to the creation of the modality neurosculpting. So we would love to hear a little bit about really what inspired you to create this, the path that informed the creation of neurosculpting. And in particular, we're so resonant with the fact that you have a really rich background in spiritual practice and meditation, like 4 years studying with monks and psychic school and all this stuff. And yet, like us, you found that that wasn't quite enough for your healing journey. So love to hear more.
Yeah, it's so multi-layered. Well, first I created neurosculpting out of a need to heal myself. And as much as I would love to say, I created it to heal the world, I didn't. I created it because I was in physical danger with my condition, which I'll tell you about in a minute. And it was coming from a lifetime of dissociative relationship to stress. And so I had a seizure condition that was undiagnosed for many, many years, but I had been having seizures, grand mal seizures, since I was 15. And I was not epileptic. Many years later, after having them for decades, I was diagnosed as having vasovagal syncope to a very high degree. I didn't understand what those words meant. So I decided, okay, let me find out what this is. And the doctor said one key thing that blew my mind. The doctor said, yeah, these are probably stress induced. And this is literally the moment that all of my dissociative disconnect came into focus, because I have been meditating since I was 12. I have been doing self-hypnosis and meditation since the age of 12, I would say like an addict. Wow. Every single day. Very bizarre for a young girl to be having that relationship to a discipline. Like you said, I studied 4 years with the Ashaya monks learning ascension, which is a form of TM. I studied just about 4 years with the Berkeley Psychic curriculum here in Denver. I've had lots of metaphysical training, spiritual training, meditation. And then this doctor says I have a stress disorder. Right. And I'm going, there's a total disconnect here. I should be floating at this point. I should be levitating. But this really put everything into clarity, because what I realized is that I was using meditation as a dissociative escape route. I was absolutely not using it to heal myself. I was using it to pause between episodes. But I wasn't learning what to do with it, how to shift my nervous system. I wasn't learning any of that. And here I am now with a stress disorder, and I'm feeling like a complete fraud in my life. I'm feeling like I've been meditating my whole life and, preaching metaphysical expansion, and yet I don't even know how to navigate my own body. So I took a huge step back and I said, clearly there's user error. And at no fault of the modalities I was using, I was not healing. So I decided I would understand my vagus nerve, my brain, my nervous system, because clearly that's what was short circuiting. So I went on to study a whole bunch of different ways into neuroscience. I don't have a degree in neuroscience, but I have lots of certificates, whatever that means, right? Certificates in medical neuroscience and neurobiology and all this stuff. All of it was for me to understand why I was having worsening grand mal seizures to the point where I had flatlined on multiple occasions. And really what forced my hand to shift and actually create neurosculpting was one of the two last seizures I had. One was in front of my daughter when she was 3 in a food court, and she watched me flatline, and paramedics had to come, and it was horrifying for her and sparked all sorts of developmental stuff in her that we're still addressing decades later. And the final seizure I had, where I just couldn't breathe again on my own, where normally in those kind of scenarios, you go into bradycardia, your heart stops briefly and then it'll kick back up. It wasn't doing that. My husband, who was my boyfriend at the time, had to keep pushing on my chest, had to keep getting me to breathe manually. And at that moment I thought, oh yeah, no, I'm done. Like, I might be a slow learner, but I've learned and now I'm done. So I'm going to hack into my nervous system and figure out what is short-circuiting between a fear response, stress response, and my autonomic nervous system choosing this option. And to do that, I had to backwards engineer my meditation practice. I had to take what worked from meditation, and then I had to add in all the things that neuroscience was teaching me about how to really speak to my nervous system and my brain. And I had to put those things together, and I practiced arranging steps to entrain my brain to high receptivity so I could kind of sneak in at the autonomic subconscious level and tinker with patterned responses. And I was learning that from neuroscience. I was learning that that was all possible. And so I played with pulling things that different studies were saying worked for this, activating this lobe, what worked for downregulating this response, what worked for heightening neuroplasticity. And I put these pieces together and came up with a 5-step process. I didn't know if it was going to work. I had no idea. All I knew was that I could not have another seizure, because if I was alone when I had the next one, it was going to be the end. And I know, I think, Brooke, you said you talk a lot about polyvagal theory, or you both do. Stephen Porges asserts that, the play dead option can be entrained so well to actually killing you if sustained over time. That was me. I was his most extreme example of freeze response, to the point where now I had to manually be induced to breathe and kick my heart back up. So I knew next seizure, if I'm alone, game over. I had a little daughter. I was a single mom at the time, and I was like, this cannot continue. So after playing with different steps to entrain myself, I was just rehearsing this budding modality that I was using for myself, having no idea if it would work, but I was like, this is my best shot at practicing and entraining a new pattern. So literally for like 8 months between the last seizure and the onset of the next one, for about 8 months, I practiced a rehearsal script going into that practice session through my entrainment steps to kind of heighten the way my body believed this rehearsal to be real. And I was rehearsing, not seizing. I was rehearsing feeling and evoking a seizure halo, and then circumventing it by fighting and kicking and screaming. And if we look at a mammalian nervous system, freeze is brainstem and most primitive. And then when we have a healthy vagus nerve, we can escalate that up to a mammalian response, which is more limbic, fight, flee. I couldn't even get to fight, flee in my life. I was a freezer. So for me, I had to rehearse not freezing. I had to rehearse next level mammalian stress response. I couldn't go to bliss, couldn't go to let it go. That was like way too many steps ahead. I had to first go to next most sustainable stress response and practice that one. And that was fight, flee. So I was practicing kicking, screaming, punching, biting, yelling at the memory of a seizure halo so that I would do anything but freeze. And I practiced this, I think I practiced from about October to probably the summer of that year, having no idea, again, if it was going to work. And then it was the summertime, and my boyfriend and I were about to go on a hike, and I was hyper stressed. And we got in the car, and I had a flare. I had a halo come, a seizure halo, which is usually just a couple seconds. And I thought, oh my God, it's going to happen. I'm going to have a seizure. And all I got out of my mouth was, which is pretty much all you have time for. And then something crazy happened. My arms started punching the dashboard. Like I was ripping the car apart. I was punching the dashboard, punching the windows. He pulled over. He had no idea what was happening. I got out of the car, and I don't even know what was happening. I was ripping things out of the back seat. I was screaming in the middle of the road. And what ended up happening was I heard myself narrate. Outside of my conscious awareness, I heard myself narrating a very traumatic episode that may or may not have ever happened to me, but was pre-verbal. It was from a time when I was pre-verbal. And I was suddenly now narrating it. And again, whether that really happened or not is totally irrelevant to my nervous system. What was relevant to my nervous system was it was locking itself around a stressor, a story. And anytime stress got me close to a response or even a felt sense, I froze and blocked it and dissociated. And this was the first time I ever let everything bubble up, much like Peter Levine's style somatic processing. It was now playing itself out where I didn't dissociate from it. And I shook for about 8 hours. Just my boyfriend took me home and I just sat in the room and shook like I was freezing. And I felt so victorious because the process I had been using, those 5 steps I had been using to practice a new response actually worked. I engaged a new autonomic response because I had been rehearsing so well. I had been in training so well. And I did not have a seizure that day. And that was the last time I ever even thought I would have a seizure. So that was decades ago. Or over a decade ago, that stopped my seizures. I've had halos and they just dissolve. So my body doesn't freeze anymore. And when that happened and I broke through my seizure, I literally gave notice at my corporate job. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I thought, God, universe, spirit, whatever source there is out there, just gave me a second chance to not seize, to raise my daughter, to be embodied and to heal whatever real or imaginary trauma this body holds. And I thought, well, I can't take that for granted. So I literally gave notice at my corporate job and thought I'm supposed to be in service to this modality. And that was the birth of neurosculpting. And I hadn't called it neurosculpting in the very beginning. I didn't have a name for it, but I knew there was 5 steps and I knew how to teach it. So that's what I did.
Oh my gosh, I want to clap. I love that story.
I know. Me too. I know Vanessa and I want to give you a standing ovation. And also if we could all just take like a weekend together to go through this instead of interview.
It's been
amazing.
It's pretty paradoxical to me that my whole life I thought I was going to get to a deep embodied spiritual existence through spirituality. And that's not. It's not. It came through science. Now, granted, had I not had the spiritual background, could I have applied the science in the same way? Probably not. So, no.
Yeah, you wouldn't have seen the bridge.
What I saw was keys to a union that I didn't know was possible. Keys to compartmentalized parts of myself starting to become embodied. And that changed everything. It's pretty wild.
I love that you're bringing out the difference between the freeze response versus the fight or flight response. Brooke and I have been talking about this a lot, behind the scenes in our conversations. We both have a tendency towards freeze. Certainly for me, not as extreme as what you described, but nevertheless, getting immobilized in the face of stress. And we've been saying, I think it has to have a different practice than someone who's at fight or flight. And that a lot of our spiritual practices over the years have been geared towards things like acceptance and just breathing slow and relaxation. And I'm thankful for it. It has its place. It's very important. But what that hasn't changed is the pattern of either in an acute moment immobilizing, or even if you look at like the larger pattern of life, finding that you're not activating your fullest energy potential. And this is exactly what we've been talking about, is there has to be a different intervention for people who are immobilizing than for people who are hyperreactive and hypermobile.
Agreed 1000%, because here's what I've seen, here's what I've experienced. So immobilization is a slow breath. It's the slowest breath possible. It is the appearance of acceptance and calm. It is all of the hallmarks that we socially attribute to someone who's grounded and can handle a situation. But it is the very opposite of that in an internal experience. It's a dissociation from having any accurate response to the world because there's no felt sense at all. So when we look at the spectrum, right, we've got, let's call middle of this imaginary line. Middle is homeostasis, right? Middle is the opportunity and the capacity to reach for expansion if necessary or reach for contraction if need be, right? One opposite side of that is fight, flee, arousal, contraction. The absolute other extreme is paralytic immobilization, which is also a contraction, but then a depression of everything, right? So when I was a meditator and a dissociator, those two things looked very similar. When I dissociated, I looked at peace. I looked like I could navigate without judgment and response. But what was actually happening was I wasn't even processing what was happening to navigate it. I was going numb. And so for freezers, in my personal experience, well, number one, it's not very sustainable because you limit the oxygen to your brain, right? Because you're depressing your heart, you're depressing your breathing capacity. So you're getting brain fog, which exacerbates the dissociation. You have a flat affect, everything looks great, and then nothing changes because society supports that kind of response to stress as socially acceptable. So for me, it was absolutely critical to learn how to feel my body. And there is no faster way for me to learn how to feel my body than to go from immobilization to activation, where now my body is screaming at me and I feel it. And I've got this adrenaline and cortisol sensation that embodied me. So like I said earlier, I had to move from brainstem governed stress response up to midbrain governed stress response long before I could actually understand what it means to forgive or be compassionate or let go. Because until you have a sense of proprioception, nociception, your being in a body, how are you supposed to have empathy for others' experiences and even feel enough to move out of judgment? I could not get there. So what I've discovered, and this may not go over well with the spiritual community, but what I've discovered is a whole bunch of us accidentally spiritually bypass, maybe not because we want to, but possibly because we're freezers and we've not been embodied at all. Therefore, we can namaste it all day long and have not processed anything or evolved through anything. And if we haven't evolved through anything, what kind of space can we actually hold for people who are in it? I don't know that there could be the level of compassion that I have for people now if I continually don't allow my body to be in its primitive, ugly expression, ugly in quotes. If I disconnect from what my human body wants to do, I'm not going to be able to hold space for anybody else. And so with neurosculpting, it's never, ever, ever about denying our feelings. It's not about even making them look pretty. It's about an awareness of what our nervous system is doing in the moment. And then a conscious choice. Is that helpful? Is that self-protection necessary in this moment? If so, stay there. Do it. Be as limbic as you need to be if it's necessary to save your life. If it's not, what tools can I reach for to downregulate from that and come back to a space of compassion and non-judgment? But I never had that choice before. I had dissociative mimicry that looked like compassion and holding space. And it took me decades to understand that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we see that a lot. The spiritual ego has this mimicry that you're describing, and I think well-intended, right? We want the experiences that spiritual practice are pointing to: unconditional love, compassion, compassionate awareness, trusting life. We want to be able to experience them, but if we can't, then we'll mimic them. And what's fascinating and what's so exciting about your work, and that you have both pieces of the puzzle, you have neuroscience and you have spiritual practice, is that all of those spiritual teachings and practices were pointing at a state change, not a personality adoption, but an actual state change, experience change. And the work of understanding the nervous system and how to work with it yourself beyond the sort of meditation, inquiry stuff, or deepening that in an experiential way, it gives us what spiritual practice is actually designed to give us, which is a state change. And this is where it's so exciting that your work is bridging those two things.
It's about a navigation skill and capacity for me. And one thing I like to tell our students, because people then develop this expectation that, well, then I should never feel stress, right? And the answer is no, because going back to what you said, Brooke, it's about capacity for state change, which means you need to experience life in order to apply the capacity for state change. It's a navigation tool. It is not a fixed state. In my mind, you don't reach and stay in nirvana. You experience homeostasis and then a pathway to it, and knowing that all of life is going to turn you around in all different directions, you just know how to get back there. So it's this navigation for me. And our students really breathe a sigh of relief when they understand, number one, they're allowed to have their stress responses and they're allowed to get familiar with them. And number two, they don't have to live in bliss 100% of the time, because that's unsustainable. Just like living in a limbic contraction is unsustainable. When we talk about polarities are not sustainable, no matter how enticing or seductive one of them might be, right? Bliss or rage, neither are sustainable to the central nervous system, whose entire design is to move you along an ever-changing spectrum. It's not supposed to be fixed. We're not designed to be fixed. And I like the idea that Ayman Sawaf teaches in his book, is it Conscious? I'm going to get the title wrong, so I'm not going to say it. But anyway, he says emotions are energy in motion. They're supposed to move. They're supposed to move. And so to hold one and put it up like it's our face that's not moving.
Well, I would imagine that it's relevant to start to talk about belief systems and narratives, right? So for myself, often if I'm immobilized, it's because a stressor came along and I had a certain belief system or narrative. So let's say, for example, I don't like the way someone's behaving, but I have a belief system that says, don't upset someone, don't make someone feel bad. And then I have a nervous system that knows how to respond by freezing. Then I may realize I don't know how to set a boundary, right? So instead of mobilizing into setting a boundary. So it seems like there must be some place for these kinds of stored associations and stored patterns of belief to be interacting with this nervous system activation.
Absolutely. I mean, pretty much all of the nervous system gets its commands from our subconscious and conscious perceptions of the world. And those are all subjective all the time, right? Because you can have two people experience the same thing and one develops a lifelong history of trauma because of it. And the other one goes on to become a world leader everything is subjective. So I always like to break it down to how does the nervous system get its information in the first place, to then layer the stories on to that. So for me, I like for people to understand kind of what's happening in utero. I mean, within the first couple of days, within the very first weeks, we have a central nervous system. We are a central nervous system. We're not a heart first. We are physically a cord, a spinal cord, a notochord, and that becomes then brainstem and midbrain. So our first most accessible aspects of human embodied life is as a nervous system getting input to evaluate how to keep us alive, self-protection. And so then we're born, right? And we have this built-in, fully capable stress response organization. But we actually can't fight and flee in the early stages of life. We don't even know our hands are our own hands, right? So really our first line of defense is all of the inputs that are talking to the immobilization system, the freeze system, because that's what we actually can do if need be, right? So freeze is first. It's usable. It's ready. Shortly after freeze, we can act upon fight, flee once we get our limbs under control. But what are the inputs? Now, in theory, right, we come out with no stories in some theory. Mm-hmm. I'll leave it at that. But we must get inputs to know how we are safe and how we are situated in the world. And those inputs come from the smell of our caregiver, the face that's constantly looking in our face as we're an infant. So we're looking at eyes, we're looking at smile, we're looking at facial muscles, and we're listening for prosody and tone of voice and touch. So our first inputs that will allow us to then create stories of the world are sensory, right? If I cry and I hear the cooing of a caregiver, mother, and I smell her and I get fed and my mouth is soft and supple so I can suckle and my eyes can crinkle in a smile, those sensory inputs tell the vagus system, this equals safety. Now I can build stories upon that. I can build the story of when my mother's face changes, I'm not safe. I can put a story to her emotional changes. I can put a story to, I'm crying and I'm not getting fed because my inputs are giving me a baseline of understanding of what safe is in the world. So the nervous system, the embodied response is the foundation that we start plugging our stories into, and they grow roots. And so it's all connected to story. Story is signaling and moving that nervous system in and out of its adaptation response based on the inputs it was given as a baseline. Now, if we didn't even get those inputs, for instance, maybe we were premature and we were in an incubator without a lot of touch and without a face right here to read facial muscles. Maybe we were, with a caregiver that didn't hold us. Maybe we were left as an orphan, and so we didn't get fed or our needs met. And so now the very most primitive vagus system has an encoding that says, the world will not meet my needs. Therefore, I will always be unsafe. And if that's the baseline, what stories do you develop in life that anchor into that, right? The moment someone forgets to call you to go out with them, that plugs into a rooted foundation that says, see, my needs will never be met. I'm not safe. I'm not accepted. I'm not loved. Someone's very, very accidental, I forgot to call you, turns into a full-blown response of trauma and I'm not loved. So stories and nervous system, they're not even separate. One is soil and one is a seed. Mm-hmm. And they interact synergistically like that. And so, I don't know, I just go off on these tangents. I get so excited to talk about what the nervous system needs and what it has created as its foundation, as a capacity to change our stories, because you can change all of your stories if you know how to treat the soil, change the soil, right? I mean, anything different can grow out of that.
Yeah. Because I think sometimes we'll see where, like, if we can get to the understanding of what you're talking about, story or lens, interpretive lens on the world, it can be really challenging and put people into a shame place if they don't know how to tend the soil, right? Because it's like, I'm doing it wrong. What's wrong with me? I need to fix myself and finally be better. And all of that kind of law of attraction, I'm creating all the bad things in my life stuff. And then it just that is through the interpretive lens, right? Of I'm bad, the world won't meet my needs. And so it just keeps compounding. So I'm curious, especially because you've worked with so many students, when that happens, if somebody's willing but not able in that kind of situation, they see, yes, this is a consistent theme, but they contract into shame and what's wrong with them. What are some ways that you do start working with the soil with people like that? I know that gets to the heart of your whole method, but I'm just
going back to the first thing is getting them an awareness that they've probably been working at the symptomatic expression level and not at the root level, right? So honestly, most of the practices that I've engaged with keep me at the symptom level. Treat the behavior, change the behavior, change the outward pattern. But sometimes that outward pattern is crafted and dictated by something so far underneath that you can change that pattern, but then a new maladaptive one will come up over here because the root has not been pulled. It's almost like Jenga, right? You can pull lots of pieces off that, but nothing's going to really move until you pull the one core. And not everybody can or should go to that core level right away because it can really disrupt the nervous system to go to a root change without having safety built around you. So really, yes.
Yeah. No, I've experienced that. It's not fun.
It's quite traumatic.
I don't recommend.
Even though the ultimate goal is change, it can be very traumatic. So what we do with our students is we orient them to safety, self-generated safety as a main practice. That's the first practice, which is, okay, maybe you're not ready to make the behavior change, possibly because you don't have an inherent sense of safety. And so let's create that. So for them, we do lots and lots of time in an induction where we're teaching them to orient to the safety of the moment, the very subtle basic needs being met. Things like orienting to your body temperature is regulated. Your heartbeat is beating itself. The ground beneath you is stable. Some people, lots of people, don't even have a roadmap for empirical understanding of safety in the moment. I'm never going to get them to make a big change until I orient them there. And for our more trauma-oriented students who have tried lots of things and can't make a change, I pull them way back and say, we're not going to go to your stories just yet. We need to cultivate a foundation of what does safety look like, smell like? What does it feel like? Can you marinate in it for 3 seconds? 3 right now. And then 4 tomorrow. And then a minute the next day. Giving them an understanding that safety can be internally generated. We give tons of vagal toning exercises to our students as daily practices, humming, singing, chanting, blowing raspberries with your lips, vibratory stimulation, any kind of vagal toning exercise they could do. We give them shaking exercises based on Dr. David Berceli's TRE practice for somatic release. So we give them the building blocks of creating small moments of safety so that their nervous system starts to create a lexicon of identifying safety parameters and familiarity. When a student gets that much inherent power to create safety in the moment and orient to it, then they can work on their lenses much faster without it threatening their identity that they've created around that lens their whole life. So for some students, they can go right through the 5 steps right away. Other students, whoa, let's slow down. Let's keep you in safety for until you're ready. But when people start to understand that they can generate a sense of safety on their own, stuff starts to change all by itself, and they start to see relief. They start to see mitigation of things like chronic pain or physically expressive symptoms of something they thought was a disease. They might see relationship improvements. They might get clarity around how to end a relationship. All sorts of things shift when you don't rely on the outside world for your sense of safety, when you can orient to it no matter what your circumstances are. You have the capacity to then stay in a prefrontal space of problem solving and compassion and non-judgment, which makes life very different. It makes life feel very much like a choice rather than a prescriptive destiny or a victim experience. So again, it always goes back to spirit and body, story and nervous system, and they're the same things for me.
So if this feels like a little bit of a cliffhanger, it's because, as a reminder, this is a two-parter conversation. So we split one long conversation into two pieces, and we have plenty more coming next week. We get into things like where psychotherapy falls short, what is the dark night of the soul from a nervous system point of view, how is technology stripping us of our ability to orient to safety and clarity and therefore dysregulating us. So yeah, bunch more coming. And thank you so much to all of you for being a part of our community and for listening to today's show. Also, big gratitude again to Lisa Wimberger for talking with us. And lastly, if you want to scope out Neurosculpting, again, that is at neurosculptinginstitute.com. Few ways to support the show and or be in touch with us. Our member platform is at patreon.com/blissandgrit, where you can donate to the show and also get rewards for your support. You can hang out with us on Instagram and Facebook or subscribe via the website, which is blissandgrit.com. If you want to get our weekly digest of the resources we're currently loving, we send that out on Fridays. And we do both work with clients one-on-one. That's how we earn our living primarily, and it's also our great joy to bring this work into that kind of setting, that kind of support and intimacy for those who are on the path, whatever that means, everything we talk about here. So you can find links to that on the website as well. We are so grateful for the reviews you've written, for the membership support that so many of you are providing to us, and for all of the notes that you send. Thank you. We'll be back next week.